You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, I don't know how many history books that he's written or helped to write. It's got to be more than 20, I'm going to guess. I've read several of them, and today we're going to discuss his latest. Our guest is Martin Dugard, and he is the co-author of many books with Mr. Bill O'Reilly, but today he's on his own. We're going to discuss Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes, and the battle that turned the tide of World War II. Thank you for coming back on the podcast. Martin, you were on for Taking Berlin. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. Nice to see you.
As I mentioned before we got started, in fifth grade, my very first book report was on the Battle of Midway. So this would have been about 1978, 79. I'm fascinated with the battle. Even now, all these years, have read about it. To me, it's the most important naval battle in the history of the United States. And to me, it's in the top 5 most impactful naval battles in the history of the world. Please tell me I'm wrong.
I won't. Sold my book, man. I'm not gonna disagree with you. No, but the thing about that is when you think about, well, when we think of other great naval battles, you think about the Spanish Armada being crushed by Nelson and other great moments, going all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. Midway is kind of lost a little bit. I think because it's in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, but it is an epic confrontation with a lot of consequences that if we had lost that battle, kind of game over. The Japanese would have owned the Pacific. It would only have been a matter of time before they made another run at Pearl Harbor and were probably much more successful the second time around.
Do you think in some ways, just in general, the Pacific theater gets eclipsed by the European theater for a variety of reasons?
Well, it was even eclipsed by the European theater during the war. We had a Europe first strategy, and I've written about Europe quite a bit, and it's easy to write about Europe. It's fun to write about Europe. You get to go to Europe and travel to all these battlefields, and they're tangible things. You can stand in a bunker. You can stand on a beach. You can imagine Patton with the Third Army, going into Bastogne, and it's very tactile. You can sense it. It's different with a naval battle. When we think of we think about the Pacific, we tend to think about Guadalcanal and Peleliu and, the island hopping. And to a lesser extent, we think of MacArthur. We don't think of Nimitz. We don't think about something like a naval battle where everybody's 200 or 300 miles apart, where the ships never see each other, because we can't very well go stand on that water and be in that place to really suss it out. So it's a different feel, and it does get overlooked. But this part of it right here, we have these aircraft carrier battles where they don't see each other, and the pilots have to go find the enemy, and at great risk of running out of fuel. It's just a different kind of fighting, and it's for me, it was a good challenge as a writer to find a way to tell that story and find a way to make an aircraft carrier sexy, for instance.
Steve, I want to talk about several things before we get to the battle. But the one thing that I think was interesting about what you just said is we had a Europe first strategy. I mean, it was a conscious one. It was a strategic decision by the civilian and military leaders. But the hatred, the visceral reaction to Pearl Harbor How did that help sustain the Pacific theater in the minds of Americans when so much attention was being placed on Europe?
It, that hatred kind of fueled the entire Pacific campaign. And the reason being that you have to remember at that time in history, from both the European and the American mindset, Japan was a second-class country. They'd invaded China, but that was kind of an Asian war, and I put that in quotation marks. And we thought of Japan as being inferior in the products they put forth, and we had no idea that we knew they were a strong naval presence, but we didn't know how strong they were. I mean, they'd been part of the Washington Naval Treaty as far back as 1920. But the thing about attacking Pearl Harbor and the loss of life was great, but it's not as bad as it could have been if those ships had been out to sea when they would have been hit, because everybody would have died instead of just a few. But the fact that we were attacked by the people that we thought were an inferior nation on a Sunday morning when we were relaxing and people were getting ready for a nice morning at the beach or going to church. I mean, it's such an American, scenario. And then to have these enemy planes come in and destroy these battleships and kill these young men was shocking to America, because we were experiencing first time what Great Britain had been experiencing for, gosh, 3 years by then. So that was the first time that we were literally attacked, and it was such an affront to our sensibility that it did fuel that hatred, and that the people of Japan were marked from that moment forward.
And there was no European equivalent to remember Pearl Harbor.
No, I mean, if uh, there were American battleships and merchant ships sunk all the time, but it wasn't the same as literally. Look, we got humiliated at Pearl Harbor. We didn't just get surprised; we got humiliated, and and in the American mindset, that was so appalling that a country like the U.S., which was ascendant at the time, we weren't the big power, but we knew we were about to become the big power, and for us to get humiliated by Japan was something the American public couldn't take.
Humiliated is the right word for all the reasons you said. Plus, and you alluded to it a few minutes ago, Pacific's pretty damn big. And for them to come all the way from Japan to, I mean, not to San Francisco, but to Pearl Harbor, not only, to your point, humiliated us, but also demonstrated to anyone who was paying attention that warfare has changed.
Yeah, it definitely. And but you think about that, the fact that they could take an entire fleet, sail out of their port in southern Japan, take this high northern latitude to kind of sneak up on Pearl Harbor when we didn't know they were coming. And they had 6 aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. It was not a small force coming in, and the fact that we discounted the fact that they could do such a thing, and you take that attack, and then just a few days later, the British battleship Prince of Wales, HMS Prince of Wales, which was one of the most fearsome fighting ships in the world at the time, was sunk by a Japanese bomb. And to that time, even despite the sinking of the Bismarck in the Atlantic, there was just the sensibility that there is no way on earth that an aircraft can sink a battleship. And when that happened, when the Japanese did that shortly after Pearl Harbor, it completely changed the balance of power in the Pacific, and it made everybody realize all of a sudden that the battleship was no longer the most fearsome fighting vessel in the seas. The aircraft carrier was most important.
It's an axiom. Maybe it's unfair, but I'd like your take on it in this particular case as it relates to your book. Generals, admirals are always busy fighting the last war. Take us into the mindset of leaders, of decision makers, naval, civilian, military, about what you just said, the aircraft carrier versus the battleship, because clearly without the ascendancy of the aircraft carrier, Pearl Harbor is the attack on that is unfathomable.
Yes, and remember too that what saved us was that our carriers were not at Pearl Harbor. We didn't have that many carriers back then, so if they had been in port, Enterprise was on its way there. Yorktown was soon to come through the Panama Canal. But if they'd been there and they had been sunk, we would have been left with just a bunch of battleships, and we would have been in no way able to fight the Japanese. And so when you think, you talk about it from the point of view of the different leaders. So, Yamamoto on the Japanese side believed in the aircraft carrier. He was a great strategist. He was a gambler. So he all in on the use of aircraft carriers. Nimitz, also forward thinking, the American admiral who takes over after Pearl Harbor. He had once been a sub guy, and to believe in submarines at a time when he did, when they were in their infancy, they were still diesel powered, shows his forward thinking, and he believed in the power of the aircraft carrier. But the most of the rest of the Navy, though, was still focused on battleships. When you think about getting hit at Pearl Harbor, what do we talk about? What gets sunk? It's the battleships. It's the Arizona. It's the Utah. It's all these other ships that either completely sunk or hit because we are so focused on battleship power. And imagine instead of all those battleships there, we'd had some light carriers or more carriers, and we would have been a completely different Navy at the time. But again, to that point, even our aircraft carriers didn't have planes worthy of the Japanese planes. The Zero was a much better plane than anything we flew at that time.
Gosh, I think it's in your book. I'd forgotten all about this plane. And I don't think it was on a carrier, but you correct me wrong. The Brewster Buffalo. I laughed out loud as I was reading that. I'm like, my God, that's archaic by this time.
You have to remember, when we think about the Battle of Britain, for instance, we think about the Spitfire and the Hurricane, but those great fighter aircraft, just 2 or 3 years earlier, the British were flying a fixed gear plane that was, barely capable of going 150 miles an hour, and the Germans are already flying these Messerschmitts they're going over 300 plus, and the same with the Zero. So yeah, the Brewster Buffalo, we had these planes that were we were just proud they weren't biplanes. There were some people arguing for the biplane. That's how bad it was.
The Curtis, whatever. Exactly. You're listening to Leaders and Legends podcast. We were talking to best-selling author Martin Dugard about his book, Taking Midway. So everybody knows that Pearl Harbor is on December 7th, 1941. The Battle of Midway is in early June 1942. Take us, and it's a broad question, I concede, but what's going on? What's going on in the Pacific between Pearl Harbor and as we start to barrel towards Midway in May of 42?
So you got to go back to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz at the time is based in Washington, D.C. He's working he's in charge of naval personnel and giving people assignments. He's called to the White House. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt first calls his office, and Nimitz's aide is very put off that this person on the phone is talking about that the admiral is Chester, and he goes, "Who is this?" He goes, "It's the president. Put him on the phone," and which I thought was pretty cool. But Nimitz has given there's some, who's just told to go to the Pacific. It was not like, "Hey, would you like to accept this command?" It was like, "No, you're going." And it's not like it is now, where if you went away, maybe you got a week off and you could fly home. He was going to be there for the duration. He wasn't going to come home until 1945. So that's a long time to be away from your wife and your kids. But he takes the train from Washington, D.C., all the way across the country before he hops on a plane and flies to Pearl Harbor. So he is shown the classified documents, the classified photographs of what happened at Pearl Harbor and what it looks like. And he realizes that the U.S. fleet is basically at the bottom of the ocean. And so he knows he has a big job ahead of him. When he gets to Pearl Harbor, he pulls the staff together. He doesn't fire anybody. He keeps everybody on who'd been there before because he believes in them. But they can't really do anything. They don't have the power to do it. So what they start doing is just a few series of light raids against the Japanese, kind of hit and run things, just trying to be a nuisance. But they need a big victory. They need a big win. And then when it comes up, as we begin to crack the Japanese codes, that they're going to come attack Midway, everything shifts. Midway saving Midway becomes the focus of the fighting in the Pacific. But at the same time, it's not just a strategic focus. It becomes a very vital focus, because if we lose, it's going to be, Nimitz knows he's going to lose his job. There are already people getting impatient for him to do something, but it's the Japanese who are taking the that are coming to him. And so he needs to do two things. He needs to put up a defensive posture the Japanese don't know about by putting his carriers to sea and to try to find the Japanese carriers. But then he needs to be offensive. He needs to go find the Japanese carriers and sink them. And that's the key to this battle, is putting those carriers at the bottom of the ocean.
Plus, Nimitz's boss, the
Ernest King.
chief naval officer of the libidinous Ernest J. King, we'll call him. He wakes up on vibrate, man. King is known for womanizing and terrorizing. What was the relationship like between them? Because King he's what, 6,000 miles away?
Yeah, King's in Washington, and he's got a place, a hall named for him at the Naval Academy. And I mean, he's a great sailor, but at the same time, he's one of those individuals that is great despite his bad boy behavior. And he has a respect for Nimitz. He gives Nimitz a lot of leeway, and their relationship is not contentious, even though as CNO, King controls everything the Navy does, and he can give direct orders, but he gives Nimitz a lot of rope on this, especially when King's intelligence people tell him that the next target is not going to be Midway, it's going to be Pearl Harbor. And Nimitz has to stand his ground and say, look, my guys tell me it's going to be Midway. We're going to stick with that. And if I'm wrong, I'll live with the consequences.
So much more is happening between December 7th and the late spring of 42 throughout the Pacific, Philippines.
Yeah.
Explain to the Leaders and Legends audience just the expansive list, the depth of American and British losses, and how Japan was so ascendant. Even the Battle of Coral Sea, which I guess you could say is a glorified draw. Maybe you think differently, but anyway, it's where is Japan sitting as we head to Midway?
In February, one of their biggest things, they take Singapore in February 1942. An inferior Japanese force overwhelms the British, who just aren't prepared. And, despite their reputation as this gallant fighting nation, the British behave very much at Singapore like the French behaved when the Panzers came through the Ardennes in May 1940. So we lose the Philippines. MacArthur famously gets on a boat and goes to Australia and says he's going to return. I'm not a big MacArthur fan. I just feel like he gets way too much credit. It's the Marines who win the battle in the Pacific. It's not the U.S. Army so much. The U.S. Army is focused on the Philippines. We lose the Philippines. We lose Guam. Singapore falls. Wake Island tragically falls because we are sending carriers to rescue Wake Island after Pearl Harbor, and then we turn them back because we're afraid that if they get sunk, we won't have any carriers in the Pacific. So everything belongs to Japan. The only thing really that they don't possess is Australia. They're making inroads in New Guinea. I mean, it's like one tragedy after another for us. But just in the same way, at the end of the war, we won it by island hopping towards Japan. They're doing the same thing in reverse at the start of the war, kind of island hopping their way towards Oahu and Pearl Harbor.
I won't say anything to our Leaders and Legends podcast friend John McManus about your Army comment in the Pacific. What is
Army guy too, though, right?
I am, yes. And so I loved his Army series. It doesn't seem like he's much of a MacArthur fan either. I need to do a podcast on him just so I can try to understand him. But a lot of times he seems like he's all fizz and no gin. And you mentioned Roosevelt. That I'd love to be in the room when MacArthur is calling President Roosevelt Franklin.
Yeah. Two things about it. I don't know if you've been to MacArthur's gravesite / memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. He's an Army guy, being buried in a Navy town, which is kind of weird. The memorial is really, really cool. I mean, and
I've heard that.
You can see his graves, but it's in a very unfortunate place. It's next to a strip mall. It's one of those things like he is a great soldier, and he should get a little bit more gravitas. But also too, when people think, I don't know, even if there's a common perception, like some people see Roosevelt as a socialist for the New Deal. Some people see him just as a man with a handicap that he didn't want to tell people about. But Roosevelt was very much a very hands-on leader during World War II. And at the same time, he was also very hands off. He let his generals and admirals run the war, and he had a formidable presence. You didn't come into the Yellow Oval, without having your act together, because he was that kind of president. So, for MacArthur to treat him like that is the same disrespect he later showed Truman. It's just this feeling that he is more consequential than any other leader involved in the whole thing. And what people forget was, and I'm getting off on a MacArthur tangent, he
Go
really,
ahead.
he wasn't really in the army leading up to it. He was an advisor to the Philippines. When you think of the U.S. Army at the start of the World War II, we have the 17th biggest army in the world behind Romania. That's how bad we were. And he wasn't really even a general in our army. He got brought back into the army as the worst after Pearl Harbor.
Field Marshal of
Yeah.
the Philippine
Yeah.
Army.
Yeah. I don't think, did he come back after? I think before that. But again, but he was in the Philippines. He likes the Philippines. He likes Asia. I don't think he'd been to the U.S. in 5 years when the war began.
So let me ask this question, because I was going to ask it later, but I'm going to hit it right now. Especially after, and we were talking about this before, Craig Simon's book on Nimitz, which is so good. Nimitz outranks Eisenhower back, when they do the 5 stars in December of 45. Nimitz, underrated, overshadowed, but brilliant and really steady.
Yeah, I like Nimitz. When you write about people, you learn everything about them. You get to really know them. And if they're good guys, you can say why they're a good guy. If they're a bad guy, you can make a list of it. Nimitz is the good guy, in my mind. He was a very steady leader. He internalized all the conflict. He had trouble sleeping. He had digestive issues. He got in the habit while he was still stationed he still has headquarters on Oahu, of taking weekends and going to the North Shore, where a friend had a beach house, and he would just spend the weekend with this family, just getting away from the war. And I find that very remarkable, that this individual with so much on his shoulders, he knew how to lean on his advisors. He knew how to trust people, but at the same time, for a guy who has that much, who did so many things, who led America to victory in the Pacific, the fact that he's just remembered as a highway in Oahu, it's kind of a travesty, because he's much more than that.
And going through the list of the people who, up until the clash of navies at Midway, you spend a lot of time, and I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get his name right. And I remember his name. I think he's portrayed by Hal Holbrook in the 76 version of the movie Midway. Lieutenant Commander Joseph
Roosevelt, yeah.
You mentioned intelligence and code breaking a few minutes ago. Connect the two, please.
You have to go back a little bit. And you said something earlier about people always fighting the last war. Well, this whole concept of codes and naval intelligence and intelligence at all was still not trusted by a lot of the higher ups in the military, particularly in the Navy. And there were a group of individuals who formed the nucleus of what became, what modern naval intelligence. And Rochefort was one of those men. And he worked with a group of fellow codebreakers that he had recruited in the basement of a building just next to the docks in Pearl Harbor. They called it the dungeon. That you walked down in there, it was nothing but cigarette smoke and the hum of a big mainframe computer, the kind they used to put the scan cards in to make it work. But they would sit there, like Rochefort he worked in a smoking jacket. He had his pipe or tobacco in his pocket. He took his shoes off as soon as he got into work and sat down at his desk, and he'd put on his slippers, and there'd be a mountain of paper in front of him. And we're not talking about neat stacks of paper. We're talking about scraps of paper, random bits of radio transmissions that he was trying to connect to find out what role these letters and numbers played in the Japanese code. And meanwhile, all the guys that work for him are doing the same thing. And they're very eccentric, idiosyncratic people. They don't like the regular Navy. They're not regular Navy. And Rochefort shows absolutely no respect for Nimitz the first time he meets him, because Nimitz literally comes down into the dungeon and stands before his desk. And Rochefort completely ignores him because he's just so out in left field. But at the same time, he's dedicated to his job. After his children and wife were forced to go back to the mainland, once he became military personnel only on Oahu, he dedicates every minute of every day to this job, to cracking the Japanese code. And they never really completely crack it, but they get enough to know the time and the date and the location of Midway as the place the Japanese are going to attack.
Talked and we focused on the American side. Let's switch a little bit. As you stated, the American carriers in the Pacific were not at Pearl Harbor. The American carriers were probably the number one main target of the Japanese attack, along with various other things, but clearly they wanted to sink those carriers. So, however fabulous the victory was, the humiliation, as you put it rightly, of the Americans at Pearl Harbor, it was incomplete. There was work to be done. In between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, there is the Doolittle Raid. How did both of these events, the Japanese humiliation of the Doolittle Raid and the fact that they didn't really accomplish their top goal at Pearl Harbor, spur them to say, look, we've got to try again, or we've got to do another throw of the dice?
Well, they had to go back. And the number one thing the Japanese, it's twofold. So first they have this raid on Oahu. And I have to say, there was a moment when I was writing this book that I was in Hawaii doing some research, and we were staying on the North Shore. And it also did dawn on me. I thought, I wonder where the Japanese planes made landfall. I wonder what that looked like. You have these planes coming overhead. What did they see? What was the beach like below? What were the trees? And they had to go up and over the mountains to get to the other side of the island. And I found the location, and I realized it was 400 meters from my hotel room. I was looking straight at it at the balcony. So
Oh,
I walked over there, and it's called Kahuku Point. And so I stood there and I imagined what it was like for those planes to come over that morning. And so what they did was they come up over the mountains, they devastate Pearl Harbor, they leave, they land. The mistake they made was they didn't make another attack when they could have. They were so interested in getting away, they didn't make a second attack because the one thing that they failed to hit was our oil reserves. So if they had taken out our oil reserves, and there were big oil tanks, it's not like we hid them someplace. They were a ripe target. They were so focused on the ships that they forgot about that. If they had come back one more time and gotten those oil reserves, we would have been completely screwed. That would have, Pearl Harbor would have been far more devastating. So that kind of sets the table for what comes next. So if they take Midway, they're now going to have a base 1,200 miles from Oahu that they can launch attacks at their leisure. They own everything else. We can't attack them. They know where we are, where we're going to go. So they need Midway.
did the Doolittle Raid, other than maybe morale and obviously Doolittle Raid, the Jimmy Doolittle Raid in early 42, it didn't cause that much damage. How did that break affect the Japanese psyche?
You remember they'd never been attacked. And they had done especially, they've been at war with China for all this time, and they were safe. Nothing was going to happen to them. But Yamamoto, in particular, as the chief strategist for the Japanese Navy, was insistent that no American bombs would fall on Japanese soil. When Admiral what's his name, Halsey, gets his attack fleet close enough to Japan, not as close as he wanted. Some Japanese outlier fishing boats saw them, so he had to launch planes a little bit sooner than he would have liked. But when those, American bombers actually dropped a few bombs close to the Imperial Palace and continued on over, huge loss of face. And that reinforced even more the Japanese desire to take Midway. Like Yamamoto needed to reassure the Japanese public and the emperor that things were going the right way. And so, what people forget is that when those bombers, they didn't come back to land on the carriers. They just kept going and landed in China. Some of the crew were caught and beheaded by the Japanese, but the Japanese kept looking for the rest of the bombers, and they couldn't find them. So what they did was they literally slaughtered thousands of Chinese who they felt were complicit in hiding the Americans. So it was not, we think of it as a nuisance raid for what the effect was. It's like when Livingston went into Africa in the 1800s. He was a missionary, and he explored all of Africa. But as a missionary, he only had one person who who actually changed his religious views because of Livingston. But he kind of planted the seed that later became the colonization of Africa. So you compare that with what Doolittle did. His bombers had very little impact on the war, other than finally getting the American public after 4 months after Pearl Harbor to breathe a sigh of relief that we were capable of hitting Tokyo. But more importantly, his people got away and caused a huge disruption in amongst the Japanese that later manifested itself as a Japanese fear that we were going to come back again, which we did.
For which Jimmy Doodle received the Medal of Honor, and a lot of his crew members, I believe, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. It was a daring, incredibly courageous raid with B-25s off the carrier Hornet. And you're right, they were supposed to get, wasn't it the Hornet?
It was the Hornet.
Yeah, they were supposed to get within like 300 miles, and they had to launch like 600. I'm making this up, but it's not even close. It's a remarkable achievement that early in the war, coming right after Pearl Harbor.
And most people forget this, and I sometimes get Doolittle and Mitchell confused, but I'm pretty sure it was Doolittle. On the second atomic bomb run when we hit Nagasaki, which is, you think of Hiroshima as kind of the middle of Japan. It's actually by where the naval base, where the ship sailed out to fight at Midway. It's kind of like Omaha. It's like in the middle. It's more agricultural, but then you have Nagasaki is like the San Francisco of Japan. It's cool, it's hilly, it's forested. Anyway, after the bomb was dropped there, when the flight crews were running out of gas, they literally had to glide into, I think they went back to Okinawa to land, and the base commander who went out to greet the crews as they barely made it to the base was Jimmy Doolittle. So all those years later.
Phenomenal. There's so much heroism there that, and just very quickly, I'll say that the Japanese conduct in World War II gets a hell of a lot more of a pass than it deserves to, because it's because of the Holocaust, not the Holocaust's fault, but we focus on that, and the Japanese treatment, especially of the Koreans and the Chinese, was positively barbaric.
And it's here's just to jump around. We went off to war in 1941, 1942 to fight fascism and tyranny. And I think that those people who went off on the ships, and whether they went to Europe or to Japan, when they came back to democracy and freedom. And I think that they would be a little bit amazed at the level of fascism and tyranny we're allowing in the United States right now in our own country. And it's such a shift. The politics of the 1930s, which we found so despicable, are kind of creeping back into our modern culture, which is, it's just a weird moment in history.
And Japan is, I guess you could call it a flourishing democracy, and has been for decades, that has completely rebuilt its devastated island. And
yeah, and for that we can thank MacArthur. Remember, he lived. If you go to Tokyo and you go to the Imperial Palace, there's Imperial Palace, and then there's a 6-story building across the street. Well, that was MacArthur's office, and he intentionally chose that building because it was taller than the Imperial Palace, and he wanted to present himself as being higher up than the emperor.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes, and the Battle That Turned the Tide of World War II. The author is #1 New York Times bestseller, Martin Dugard, making a second appearance on the podcast. Secret Codes. Who is AF? What is AF? And why does that matter?
It's super important. Whenever you start writing a book because it's a brand new topic, right? So no matter how much you know about other aspects of the war, World War II is so vast that all of us, I don't care, how great a historian is, there are big gaps in your knowledge unless you've spent a lot of time with stuff. So when I pivoted from Europe with those first 3 books to the Pacific, my brother-in-law, told me, he goes, "What are you writing?" I said, "I'm writing about Midway." He goes, AF. And I didn't know what he was talking about. It's like, hey, look I'm just at the start of my research. I'll get there. But AF is Midway. That's the code for Midway. And this is where
Whose code?
it's the Japanese code for Midway. But here's where it gets kind of fun because Rochefort and his cryptographers had kind of figured out some of the Japanese 2-letter combinations for different. They knew what Wake Island was. They which 2 letters were Wake Island. They knew which 2 letters were Oahu, and then there was they just didn't know what AF was, and so what they did was they sent a message in the clear from Midway to Oahu saying, the the water, our water purification is out. It's going to take us
desalinization plan or whatever.
Yeah. And so they sent it in the clear, and they did that intentionally to see if the Japanese would respond. And sure enough, the Japanese came back, and what they were telling everybody else, AF is having issues with their water. And so that was the confirmation that it was, in fact, Midway was AF. And then we knew from their battle plans that we were decoding that they were going to attack AF. And that's when we could literally say, all right, it's going to happen June 4. And as a matter of fact, one of the intelligence officers went to Nimitz, and Nimitz said, and it wasn't Rochefort who went, he was his liaison to the intelligence community. He said, "When's it going to happen?" And the guy was like, did not want to give the wrong answer because it's the end of your career. Also, it's going to really go badly for the U.S. And he told him flat out, it's going to happen at this time, it's going to happen at this location, it's going to happen, this is how it's going to go down. And so that's when Nimitz gambled. That's when he put all of his resources into thwarting that attack. Imagine if Nimitz had sent, 3 aircraft carriers up off a few hundred miles off of Midway, and the Japanese were attacking Oahu instead. It would have been catastrophic. There was so much at stake.
And that's where we were talking about a few minutes ago, Nimitz not getting enough credit. It seems it's easy now, right, to be teleological and say, well, this is, of course, what you were going to do. But sending your only 3 carriers, because the Lexington had been sunk at Coral Sea, sending your only 3 working carriers, and one of them, Yorktown, was kind of working, maybe, because it had been damaged so badly at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Do you have a word that you'd use to describe Nimitz's decision? Ballsy? Nuts?
I was going to say balls. That was my big old cojones. How do you sleep? I mean, how do you commit to that? You commit to believing in the intelligence. You commit to all that stuff. How do you go to bed at night and not toss and turn? Because you think about all the potential loss of life. You think about the course of an entire war could shift one way or the other. And literally, as the battle came out, within 6 minutes, there were 6 minutes in the middle of that battle that changed the world. And it's amazing to think that that's exactly what happened.
So let's get to it. It's early June. The Japanese have sailed from Japan. Their main fleet is headed towards Midway. They have sort of a diversionary fleet heading toward the Aleutians to throw a little shade. The Japanese obviously don't know that we know they're going to Midway. So they're surprised when we see them there and they see us there. The Battle of Midway itself, I'm going to use the term lucky. How disrespectful is for me to use the term that the United States, despite the bravery, despite the hard work to break the code, despite Nimitz's courage, command courage, and he's got somebody commanding his one of his carriers, Raymond Spruance, who went to Shortridge High School in Indianapolis, Indiana, about 5 miles from where I am. Same high school as Kurt Vonnegut, same high school as Richard Lugar.
Wow.
And he's not even a carrier guy. but he's commanding because Halsey's sick, Admiral Halsey. All these things had to go right. And still, luck played such a role in those 6 minutes.
It's interesting. You talk about Spruance. First of all, the Navy at the command level was much smaller back then. So, Nimitz's wife and Spruance's wife knew each other. They're actually buried with next to each other, all four of them. But what really ticked off the carrier guys was that you had this guy who was not a carrier guy. They're sailing into this battle. Everybody's keyed up, and he stays in his cabin reading dime store novels. You got to pass the time some way on a ship. There's only so many orders you can give. So they keep waiting for him to do something aggressive and bold, and he believed firmly in patience, and that really really saved the day for the U.S. But yeah, it was lucky because so you have people just to the ABCs of the battle. You have the islands in Midway. There are two. Sometimes there's a third if the wind blows the sand a certain way, but the Japanese they're sending an invasionary force to take that island. And first, what they want to do is kind of loosen things up by bombing and strafing. They don't destroy the runways because they want to use the runways because you basically have a forward Air Force base if you can capture this place. So they're sending an invasionary force towards Midway, but at the same time you have an entire carrier fleet whose job is to launch the planes that are going to attack Midway, and they don't know we have carriers in that part of the Pacific. They're completely oblivious to this fact, but everything depends upon our carriers, and like you said about the Yorktown, they patched that up after Coral Sea. They literally, within the course of a weekend, they got ready to go back out to sea after it had been holed by very dangerously by a bomb. So anyway, 3 U.S. carriers have 4 big Japanese carriers. Hiryu, Akagi, I forgot the other 2. I mean, they're big, but these are
Kaga and Soryu.
Yep, and these are where they launched these are the guys who launched on Pearl Harbor. So these are good pilots. These are really veteran pilots. They've flown in China. They've done Pearl Harbor. So these are not new young pilots. These are veterans, and they have the better aircraft in their bombers and with the Zero. And so, but they don't know that we have carriers in the area. So we send our planes off to find these Japanese carriers, and one group finds them, but they don't tell everybody else where they're located. And then the Japanese change course because they've been attacked by these American planes coming out of nowhere. They change course. And like you said, just by luck, a couple pilots look down from 20,000 feet and you see the one thing you don't see in the ocean, which is straight lines. Everything in the ocean is random and topsy-turvy. When you see straight lines, straight white lines in the ocean, that's created by a ship, and it's created by mankind, and that's how they found the Japanese carriers. And so we had tried with torpedo bombers, and to give a visual, a torpedo bomber flies low and slow, just 30 feet off the waves, drops its torpedoes, and hopefully it connects, and when it connects, it explodes. But they fly so slow; they're barely going 100 miles an hour, and so the Japanese destroy all those torpedo bombers. Those poor guys are just sitting ducks, but they make the run anyway. Meanwhile, you have dauntless dive bombers. They're the ones who spot the Japanese fleet, and they're at 20,000 feet. But when they attack, it's like a falcon pouncing on a squirrel. They dive straight down from 20,000 feet and drop their bombs at about 15, or their torpedoes about 1,500 feet, and that's what happened. Within those 6 minutes, 3 of the Japanese carriers were sunk, and they were literally they had you have these torpedoes. They don't just puncture the flight deck because the Japanese flight deck was made of wood. It's made of teak, and it actually had the rising sun painted on it, which the U.S. pilots used as a target. Which great. And so those torpedoes went straight down through the flight deck, which was just 2 inches of steel below that teak, into the hangar deck. And it's important that it hits the hangar deck because that's where the munitions are being loaded. That's where the planes are being refueled. So you have gasoline lines snaking all over the place, especially high octane airplane fuel, aviation fuel. And so these things, they don't just blow up. They send flames 300 feet into the air. And in one after the another, 3 are hit. We can't find a fourth, but we find it the next day. So all those Japanese carriers sent to the bottom of the sea. The Japanese, and you can't rebuild a carrier overnight. So the Japanese don't just lose 4 mighty carriers, but they lose all the pilots who can't find another place to land. And these are, like I said, veteran pilots. You can't train, the pipeline to build a pilot is not 3 months or 4 months. It's like 2 years and 3 years. So they lose all of these resources in within 6 minutes. And it's only, they kind of, in a rage, the Japanese from the Horyu go off to look for any American carrier, and they finally find the Yorktown, and they sink the Yorktown, which, I don't know, if you, again, you get to know people when you write a book. You also get to know the carriers when you write a book. And so I had researched the history of the Yorktown, and when I kind of find when I had to write about the sinking of it and it going under, and the battle flags were still up, and the other ships where everybody's standing at attention as they watch it go under. It was a very emotional moment. I mean, it's how you can make it, an aircraft carrier is something that you can really fall in love with, but that's kind of what happened as I wrote this book.
And the Japanese thought they'd already sunk the Yorktown.
Yeah, well, they were shocked because after Coral Sea, they were sure, it was like, what is this doing here? Yeah, that must have been quite a surprise.
The courage of the pilots you mentioned, some of the torpedoes were defective. They knew their planes weren't, to the same quality as the Japanese planes. In many cases, as you detail in your book, they go to the very, very end of their fuel line. Talk a little bit. You mentioned a tough moment writing about the Yorktown sinking, but these 25, 26, however year old men who are flying these missions, I guess I should just admit I'm getting emotional. I just can't even imagine being in their place.
There's two, to me, two kinds of courage on display there. You got these torpedo bomber guys who, they've got the training, they've got, their loyalty to their squadron mates. And so as they go in for these attacks, which are really basically suicide attacks, they know it. They know that their chances of success are very small, but they do it anyway. I can't even imagine the courage it takes to know that you're doing something that is going to cost you your life within a matter of seconds. And then just as badly, all those dive bomber pilots, well, all that time they were looking for the Japanese fleet, they're burning fuel, and they've been up there a long time. So when they finally deliver their payload and get away, look, if it's me, I'm going straight back to my carrier. I'm going to take the most shortest, most direct route. But they were under orders to fly a dogleg pattern, kind of as a feint. They had to go 40 miles one way to make sure the Japanese didn't follow them directly to the carrier. So they had to go 40 miles one way and then follow a homing beacon back to their ship. And a lot of guys just didn't have the gas. So a lot of them had to set down. A number of them were later rescued by Catalinas PBY-5As, but some guys spent a day on the water. Some guys spent a week on the water. Some guys spent 2 weeks on the water. Some guys were never found. So you imagine you've landed, you've inflated your life raft, you probably hear the plane looking for you, but you're just a speck on the ocean that they probably can't see. And then at some point, they're not coming. I mean, that must just be the most horrible feeling.
Or God forbid, to your point, you get captured by the Japanese.
Yeah, well, and
I'm not going to say rescued because that obviously isn't the right verb.
Yeah, that's the thing is all sides in the war committed atrocities. It's not like the Japanese were exclusive, but I think it's really heartless to rescue 2 guys out of the ocean, and then torture them to give you information, and then basically throw them off the side of the ship, knowing they're going to sink to the bottom of the ocean. That's heartless. I mean, keep them a little bit longer. I don't care, but it's just that to me is cold blooded.
We started the podcast, and we have just a few more minutes left with Martin Dugard, author of Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes, and the Battle That Turned the Tide of World War II. We discussed at the beginning of the podcast the impact of the American victory at Midway. It's the most important in my view, American battle, land or sea, in World War II. Now, I wouldn't expect you to summarize 3 years of war here in the next minute or two. What was the immediate effect of the American victory? How did it change both the tactical and strategic direction of the war?
Well, you have to remember that the Japanese lost 4 carriers, but they still had others. They had built a very advanced navy. And yet then we go into the Marshalls, we begin that slow process of island hopping, but now we can do it with a little bit more emphasis because we know the Japanese have lost some of their biggest resources, and so but there's also a confidence about it too. It was a huge victory at the time, not just for the Navy but for the American people. We needed a big victory over the Japanese, and the dual little raid was just a spark of enthusiasm. But this was a key victory, and again, you have to go back to Nimitz, just the courage it took to launch that, and he guided the course of the rest of the war in the Pacific, and he was only too happy to let people like Halsey, his buddy and his top, fighting admiral, but also MacArthur, let them have the glory. He just wanted to do his job and go home, and I respect that a lot, just the professionalism about that. It wasn't about ego. If you're at that level of power, it's easy to have an enormous ego, but he was more, insistent upon getting the job done.
And there was no more talk, no more incident, no additional incidents of Japanese aggression, strategic aggression in the Pacific. It stopped. And it
They
turned the war into a defensive war of the Japanese, of attrition, which is the very war they were trying to avoid.
Well, Yamamoto knew that even before the war. He said, "We gotta win in 6 months or we're out." And, Nimitz does something that people debate to this day, but I think needed to be done was, Yamamoto was, he was everything to the Japanese Navy. Like I said, eccentric, hard to be around, but at the same time, a brilliant strategist. So when Nimitz later finds out the airplane that Yamamoto's gonna be in as he's going through the South Pacific, and he literally sends some Army airplanes in to shoot him down. It's as close to an execution as you can commit in wartime, and some people look at Nimitz as a bad guy for that, but,
Oh,
you I just don't think you can go there.
and I have then a little bit of nerdity. My favorite World War II bit of trivia involves the assassination of Yamamoto, and that is the code used by the American pilots to let their superiors know the shooting down of Yamamoto was a success. And it wasn't in your book, which now makes me believe that it's not true, but I'm going to stick with it. Do you remember what it is?
Oh, I don't know it.
Ding dong, the witch is dead.
Yeah, it doesn't
And
really
you're only 4 years away or 3 years away from the Wizard of Oz, and that's
something
the
to say.
code that the
Yeah.
Americans used. You mentioned the pilots when the Japanese really needed their experienced, brave, courageous, smart pilots at the end of the war, partly because of Midway, they didn't have them. So then they had to rely on ill-trained kamikaze pilots who, as I recall, weren't even trained to land their planes.
No, they weren't. And we did something interesting, and I know short time is short, and we still do it today. So if you're an American pilot and you fought at the Battle of Midway, and you've probably been, fighting the war for a good 6 to 9 months by the time, not that Midway is over, but, maybe as you get through the summer, we rotated those people back to the States to train other young pilots and to show those young pilots how to dogfight, how to be strategic in the way they dropped a bomb. And we did that throughout the war. If you did your time, you became experienced. And when you got to that level of burnout, when you're actually putting your own life in danger, they rotated people back to the States. So we always had a fresh supply of experienced pilots. Japanese didn't do that. You flew your aircraft until you died or the war was over, you were captured or whatever, and that to their detriment because you didn't have that core group of people showing the other new pilots how to succeed in battle.
And to your point, you mentioned about Yamamoto, we have to win the war in 6 months. Admiral Yamamoto was famously a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. So it reminds me of my favorite quote about the United States, and it's not by an American. It's by Sir Edward Grey, who was foreign secretary for the British during World War One. And he said, America is like a gigantic boiler. Once lit, there is no limit to the heat it can produce. Yamamoto knew that. And when the Americans talk just for a second, because I know you know about this as well, the almost unfathomable industrial production of the United States when it came to rebuilding the Navy and its Naval Air Corps in the Pacific.
Well, we went from being completely unprepared for war to almost to the point of overproduction. Prior to the war, we weren't building fighters. The planes we were building were transport planes, big transport planes. And overnight we flipped and we're producing thousands of aircraft of all kinds and not just any aircraft, but better aircraft. We learned from the mistakes we made at Midway so that, new designs like the F4U1 Corsair entered the fighting. We had all of a sudden we were the nation with the best planes. Ultimately, I think the best American fighter plane of the war was the P-51. Uses the straight line Merlin engine that the Spitfire uses, but a far more effective aircraft. But that was we went from the Brewster Buffalo, let's say, in 1940, 1942, to the P-51 at the end of the war. And the same with ships. We made so many ships during World War II. It's just amazing how quickly we began turning out aircraft carriers. I mean, we went from having, I think, it's been a bit since I wrote the book, but I think, Hornet was like CV9 or CV10 or maybe 7 or somewhere. CV is the designation for an aircraft carrier.
Right. Single digits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we had single digits. By the end of the war, I think we had, actually the USS Midway was commissioned just after the end of the war. It's CV-43. So through the course of the war, we built that many aircraft carriers, and you think
and battleships and cruisers and subs, and I mean it's and we're doing all this in Europe, and we're supplying our allies. I mean, I'd love to read. I know there's the book Why the Allies Won, talked a little bit about it by Richard Overy, but I'd love to read a really strong book that just says basically you have no clue about what happened when this country decided we're going to start building war material.
Well, when we think war, we think of, tanks and bombs and ships and planes, but think about all the other things. We had boots, uniforms. The average a soldier in Europe during the second half of the war after D-Day went through uniform about every 30 days. So we needed boots, uniforms, we needed socks, we needed food, like all these things. I mean,
trucks. How many trucks did we give to Stalin?
Oh, too many. We shouldn't have given him. Given him a single one.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned small business. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of United States Army Air Corps Captain P.E. McAllister. Our guest, #1 New York Times bestselling author Martin Dugard. The book, Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes, and the Battle That Turned the Tide of World War II. As we've discussed, without not only the American victory at Midway, but the scope of it, the magnitude of it, World War II in the Pacific looks a hell of a lot different. Martin, thank you so much for writing this book and for coming back on the podcast.
Robert, it is great to be on, and I hope you have me back when the next book comes out, whatever it may be.
Oh, you have your ticket is punched. You can come on anytime you want.
I appreciate that, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.